Good morning to those joining us across the United States and the Americas. Good afternoon to those joining us across the Atlantic. I'm Damon Wilson, Executive Vice President of the Atlantic Council. Welcome to Atlantic Council Front Page, our premier live ideas platform for global leaders. Today, we have the distinct pleasure of hosting Pete Buttigieg to discuss the future of U.S. global leadership. Pete Buttigieg, of course, is the former mayor of South Bend, Indiana, a veteran and a husband, and was an electrifying Democratic candidate for U.S. president. We're hosting this conversation in a time of great uncertainty, both globally and here at home, especially about America and its role in the world. Internationally, the rule book that many of the Atlantic Council's founders created is being thrown out. The rise of authoritarian competitors like China and Russia is shifting the global balance of power, yet transnational challenges like this pandemic and climate change require an urgent international response. And on this changing stage, the ability of the United States to lead abroad is intrinsically connected to its sources of strength at home. However, as our country heads into arguably the most important presidential election in recent history, we seem more divided than ever in the halls of Congress, on the streets protesting systemic racism, and in our communities when it comes to COVID-19. The caliber of last night's presidential debate leaves many of our allies and partners worried about the future of America. So how can the United States heal its divisions, renew itself at home, and be capable of leading abroad? Is that what the American people want? How do we tap public support for leadership abroad? And how do we lead with our values and inspire once again hope in America's ability to do good? And finally, what's the vision for a new U.S. foreign policy fit for today's challenges? These are issues we're tackling at the Atlantic Council, and I think Mayor Buttigieg has some answers to these difficult questions, and he's graciously agreed to share them with us today. In the Democratic Party's presidential primaries, Mayor Pete stood out as a thoughtful, visionary leader, the youngest candidate who captured the imagination of many voters with a unifying message. He also represents the next generation of political leaders and will no doubt have a prominent voice in the future of our politics. As an out leader in national security myself, as a leader of an institution with an LGBTI fellowship intended to foster the next generation of out leaders in foreign affairs, I'm especially delighted to welcome Mayor Pete to our platform. We're also so pleased to have Margaret Brennan from CBS News with us today. Margaret's a remarkable journalist who we welcome back to the Council to moderate this conversation about the domestic underpinnings of U.S. foreign policy. And our very own Vicente Garcia, producer of this program, will close us out today. Finally, for all of our viewers out there, please send in your questions and your comments using the hashtag #ACFrontPage. Thank you, and with that, over to you, Margaret.
Thank you very much, and good morning, and thanks to all of you who are watching and engaging with us today. And I will dive right in to our conversation with Mayor Pete. And Mr. Mayor, if you could unmute your line, and we will dive right into this new Zoom reality that we're all getting used to here. And I want to ask you a lot of sort of big picture questions, but I'll start on what happened last night. There wasn't a lot of foreign policy discussed on that debate stage, and I wonder what you think Xi Jinping, Vladimir Putin, our adversaries and our allies, what they walked away thinking.
Well, first of all, thanks for the chance to be part of this program, and I'm thankful for the leadership of the Atlantic Council, which is more timely and relevant than ever. And as I think about last night's debate and what it means around the world, it's hard not to think about another body blow to American credibility at a moment when American leadership is in many ways needed more than ever. What we saw last night was not even a debate. It might be described as a performance. I think it's widely viewed as a disaster. And I think that America's adversaries, certainly anybody who is eager to see America play less of a role in world leadership, would have been rubbing their hands in glee at the chaotic scene. Of course, that's really par for the course with the chaotic scene that is American politics today. And the important thing I believe to remember is that it remains the case that the world needs a certain kind of American leadership, not just any America, but America at its best, just as America cannot move forward in the way that we need to without cooperation with our partners and allies around the world. That fundamental reality didn't change last night. What last night did was bring into vivid relief the harms being done by the current president's disregard for any norms or even the basic democratic customs that hold this country together, and a reminder of why it is so urgent that we get onto a different path.
I know you have been helping to prepare Senator Kamala Harris for the next round of debates, given that you know Vice President Pence from your time in Indiana and playing him, as I understand, during debates. Do you expect foreign policy and the U.S. role in the world to be more a part of that conversation?
Well, I hope it will, because it's more important than ever. Although we've got to do, and by we, I mean really the community of people who care about foreign policy, we've got to do a better job of connecting the dots and making it clear why it's very much affecting our day-to-day lives, including in the middle of the country where I live, and really draw that out. Now, in a sense, we're living through the most visible moment since 9/11. In which a chain of events that started thousands of miles away from the US changed life in the US. So it's actually a very rich moment for us to be talking about foreign policy, international cooperation, US leadership on the global stage. But it needs to be rendered in a way that makes it clear to my neighborhood in Indiana how life might be different, how life might be better on a day-to-day basis if we have better foreign policy. I very much hope that will emerge in the vice presidential debate and perhaps in future presidential debates. But obviously, it's difficult when we have a noise machine going off that it really isn't interested in foreign policy or any policy, but rather the kind of showmanship that just has a way of hijacking the human mind and sending our politics into a spiral.
So what is that affirmative case? What is the unified foreign policy vision of the Democratic Party right now?
Well, I think it's about making sure that American values and interests are aligned. Remember, America is the most consequential democracy since the Athenians. And so it really matters that we be leading in the advancement of democracy and rights. Now, we are not in a great position to do it right now because our own president doesn't seem to have a very high level of commitment to democratic norms right here at home. But when we do, it's good for democracy, and it's good for America. We are in a world where the threats have never been more interconnected. Again, the pandemic is a prime example, but in many ways, as devastating as it's been, it may be remembered in the grand scheme of things as a dress rehearsal for climate change. Think about all the things it has in common. A phenomenon that you can't see with the naked eye, but that is dramatically changing life. Something that depends on our ability to pay attention to what science has to say, and something that by its nature is global, that America cannot handle without cooperating with the rest of the world, and that the world can't handle without America. Because we're such a big part of the world stage. So whether we're talking about climate, whether we're talking about the pandemic, making sure that we fortify our alliances, making sure that we are in fact credibly leading on the world stage, this has never been more important. And I think the vision, certainly the Democratic vision, is for America to restore our credibility and reestablish that leadership role that only the US can play.
When I hear Joe Biden speak, particularly about America's role in the world, it's a lot about some of the words you just used, restore, right? It's restoring, but in a way that seems like going back to where we were versus charging ahead. And often some of the things that are referred to in specific terms, the Paris Climate Change Accord, the Iran deal, other approaches to China, for example, they aren't addressing the world as it is now. They are addressing the world as it was then. And even at that time, those were accords that were recognized as part of a solution, but not doing away with the problem. So what is the forward vision here? Because we're only really hearing about restoration.
Yeah, I think this is a critically important point. What we need to restore is the level of credibility that the United States had. But there's no restoring an old order that was, frankly, already pretty rickety as we came into the 21st century. And in so many ways is not quite up to the challenge of dealing with the issues that are at hand. So you think about something like the WHO, right? That was an institution that needed support and needed change. What's definitely not the solution is to just get the U.S. out of it completely. You think about things like the JCPOA. The reality is that the future of the work to contain Iran's regional malign activities, and certainly the future of the effort to prevent Iran from obtaining nuclear weapons, which is what the JCPOA was all about. It's not like we're just going to be able to rewind, even in the best case scenario, and say, okay, let's just go back and do that again. The Paris Climate Accord, I think, needs to be regarded now as a statement of what the countries of the world are prepared to do, but again, just a template or a beginning for what it's actually going to take to contend with the challenge at the level it's at. And this is where, maybe some of the best vocabulary for this comes out of what the Biden-Harris campaign has been saying domestically. So in terms of what we've got to do to rebuild our economy post-COVID, the idea of build back better is we're not just rewinding to what we had before and recreating the same arrangements with the same winners and the same losers and the same weaknesses. We can't do that because we know that's part of how we came to be here. That's why whatever we come up with has to be better. I think the same is true in terms of the foundations of the U.S. presence globally. And the reality is we're going to have a lot of work to do building the kind of credibility we need. But I think it remains fundamentally important for the U.S. to lead, if only because of the dimensions of our economy and our democracy, and because the alternative models that are being put forward, especially the extent to which the Chinese model is being held up as some kind of more stable alternative. These are not an attractive direction from the perspective of liberal democracy for the world to be going in.
So what does that mean on day one? Because all of the domestic problems that you referred to there don't go away with the election. You will have an economy that is convulsing. You will have a public health crisis. You will still have the challenge of figuring out how to get a vaccine expedited out there to the American people. It seems like with such a full agenda, foreign policy is really going to be pretty low down on the list. And yet there are a number of crises that we'll confront right at the front door on day one. So what is the priority and how do you sell that to a public that says, look, I'm fine with nationalism. I want my vaccine first?
Right. This is where I think both pandemic response work and climate work kind of light the way ahead. The only way to establish trust that is really enduring is to build it up through credible behavior over long periods of time. We don't have long periods of time. We don't have long periods of time to establish the trust we need in the United States going forward. We don't have long periods of time to deal with the emergencies at our global doorstep, like the pandemic and like climate. So what we've got to do is establish a clear set of commitments to what we will do to lead the way and what we will offer to those who partner with us in terms of the vaccines and in terms of the climate. And then we're going to need the president to communicate to the American people how this is making us stronger and how this is making us better off, how it's leading to a more peaceful world, which, by the way, benefits the parts of the country like where I live that disproportionately are providing troops into the American armed services. What it means for our bottom line and why our economy is stronger when we're not in a chaotic scrum with other countries like what happened with the trade war. So look, the reality is a lot of this has to do with what you don't do. Things that up until now it was possible to simply assume that an American president or an American administration will not do. And that's just going to take a while to make clear that it won't happen again. But it's going to take more than that. And that's where specific US commitments from logistics to research to funding on getting the vaccine everywhere it needs to go. And again, that climate leadership actually, I think presents a big opportunity for us to rally the country here at home in a national project that is also part of what we're doing to collaborate with peoples around the world to deal with big problems.
But when you look at public polling right now that Pew and other research centers have done, there are some commonalities that kind of cut across political lines. One of them seems to be this conclusion on Afghanistan that bringing troops home is incredibly politically popular. I know you deployed there. The Trump and Biden teams seem to have the same policy, which is to negotiate a peace sharing deal between the Taliban and the elected leaders and to leave a residual force. Iraq, similar idea. China, both teams very different approaches in terms of language, but directionally, they're talking about really being head to head in a competition. What fundamentally is different other than tone and tenor?
Well, I think China is a good example of where maybe at a surface level, you might see a parallel, but it couldn't be more different. Think of it this way. A U.S., certainly under a Biden-Harris administration, will be standing up for democracy. And that means China doesn't get a pass on what's going on in Hong Kong and the repression of democracy there. China doesn't get a pass on rounding people up and putting them in concentration camps in Xinjiang. What you see
They're
with this
already being
president
sanctioned
is
for those things.
what you see with this president is a willingness to backburner those issues in order to get concessions in a trade war that largely wound up just amounting to getting back to a status quo ante, right? This president will create a crisis and then try to create the impression that there's some kind of victory in getting halfway back out of it. And that's really what we saw with the trade war. And you don't have to be a subscriber to foreign affairs to see what happened to anybody involved in beans, for example, in my part of the country, and what it meant for us to have this kind of destabilization. Remember, farmers are in the business of managing uncertainty, and they're already dealing with uncertainty from weather. These are folks who do math for a living. They're figuring out how to place their bets, so to speak, their investments, how to time when to sell. The last thing they need is chaos and uncertainty, and that's what they got an awful lot of during the trade war. I mean, these are things that
they've also got a lot of financial aid from the U.S. taxpayer to deal with that.
And again, that was basically to make up for a crisis that was created by the same administration that was then going back trying to reverse the damage, right? And I talked to a lot of farmers who said, I got my bailout check, but I'd much rather just be able to sell my product and to thrive. And in the middle of the country, this becomes about values and about interests, which again shouldn't be separated. So I think you'll see. Here's the other thing about China, right? The president's America First rhetoric masks an America alone reality. And one of the most important advantages we have with respect to China's behavior is our network of alliances, our transatlantic network of alliances, and our global alliances. Now, China's most prominent alliance is probably North Korea, but they are working very hard to accumulate the kind of soft power that we are sacrificing. You look at the Belt and Road Initiative, you look at investments in goodwill that are being made. By some measures, more happening with Chinese investments in infrastructure around the world than investments from the federal government in the United States. And we're talking about trillions of dollars. It would be fundamentally different under a new administration that will absolutely recognize the strategic competitor and challenge that China represents, but not be pushed into being silent about human rights issues in order to try to get some kind of concession on a trade deal whose greatest effect seems to be to reverse harms that were created by all the bluster in the first place. We need an actual strategy, especially dealing with rivals who famously think in 20, 30, 50-year terms. And we got a president who clearly doesn't really take much interest in anything that's going to happen beyond what's right in front of him and his own financial and political gain.
But when you look at public polling and the aversion to use of force and the popularity on both sides of the aisle of that conclusion, I just wonder what you think the Democratic vision is in terms of that standard for use of force. I recently interviewed Tony Blinken, for example, and he said one of the things that haunts him to this day is the failure, and he used that word repeatedly, the failure that he took personally on as a member of the Obama administration of stopping the slaughter in Syria. So what is the answer to that? Is the Democratic vision for U.S. values that the U.S. has a responsibility to protect and to use force to stop some of the human rights abuses you say will be confronted more directly by a Biden administration?
Well, the bar will be high. That's something that you can expect, not just from the Democratic Party, but as you say, is where the American people are. But I think what you would also see is the capacity to deal with this in the context of an international community led according to American values that are also shared values, right? In other words, the moment where atrocities are getting out of control and a president is asked to consider a use of US force, is a moment several steps down the chain from the moment when something might have been prevented by rallying an international coalition. Now, what we've seen in terms of the Middle East policy of this administration is zero interest in preventing atrocities, and frankly, zero interest in aligning American interests with American values. You'll hear about maybe arms sales that might benefit some narrow economic interest, not a whole lot. About emphasizing the future that we want to build. And as the regional competition, in particular, you look at what's happening with Iran really facing off with Arab competitors, as well as the treatment of Israel. What we're seeing is an environment that could become more unstable by the day. A knee-jerk response in terms of interjecting force into that is obviously not going to stabilize it.
But that doesn't sound different than the
Obama
administration.
Yeah, I mean, the circumstances are going to be different from the Obama administration, but it's also clearly the case that there's a tendency toward greater and greater instability in so many parts of the world right now. That's going to be fueled by the kind of leadership that we have now. It can be remedied by the kind of leadership we might have, and that's where I think also the kind of credibility and trust building that a figure like Joe Biden is uniquely capable of delivering, because people have known him for a very long time, I think can have the kind of calming effect that's going to be needed in order for us to recalibrate any number of relationships or regional or global dynamics that we're facing going into the 2020s.
Joe Biden frequently references sort of the original sins of this country, with slavery, and also with what settlers of this country did to Native American populations. That's persistent. That's been there throughout American history. Do you think there's anything different now in terms of the kind of social movement we're seeing right now on the racial justice front that changes the ability of America to, as others would say, lecture the world on values? How do you do that?
Well, the really extraordinary thing is the way that we're facing it. So it's not pretty right now. Last night, the president incapable of denouncing white supremacy, which should be the easiest thing in the world. But what we're seeing on the streets and what we're seeing in our communities is something I don't think we've seen before in terms of the level of awareness, the level of reckoning, the willingness to confront an original sin that goes back 400 years, but is also very much part of us. Look, moral authority has never been a function of moral purity. This is not about the US saying, we've never had any problems, so you ought to do what we say. As a matter of fact, I think precisely because of the complex and sometimes dark history of racial injustice and colonization in the US, I think we're in a position, as if and only if we're a country that's actually done the work, so to speak, that's actually wrestled with these things, to be engaging on their importance around the world. I mean, you think about what America could represent in our lifetimes, something the world's never actually seen, which would be a large-scale, fully multiracial, fully democratic, pluralistic society that will be majority minority by the 2040s. If we actually became the kind of country that activists are insisting we could be, we would represent something in terms of the ability to have an equitable multiracial country in the 21st century that I think would be as important, perhaps as dramatic a model as the arrival of the America as a formal of America as a formal democracy in the 18th century represented then. It all comes down to what the 2020s are going to be like. America's going to do one of two things in the 2020s when it comes to these issues. We're either going to tumble down the path of this kind of white supremacy devouring our moral foundation as a country. And it's always been the thing that had the greatest risk of ending the American project. And that's definitely one future that's in front of us. But the other one is that we actually wrestle it to the ground and win, that the American project defeats this demon that's been built into it from the very beginning. If we can do that, the consequences of that will be incredibly powerful, not just morally here at home, but I think around the world. And by the way, one down payment on that, one thing we could be doing and need to be doing as a country that would make a big difference is if we can build representation that is a diplomatic corps of those who serve this country and represent it around the world that reflects the diversity of this country, because that would be one way to demonstrate our awareness that it is one of our greatest strengths. And it's something that I think adds to the credibility of a United States that wants to be able to speak with a straight face when we're addressing and engaging international players on subjects like human rights and the treatment of minorities.
I want to bring in two of our questioners. First off, Mr. Ankit Desai from the Atlantic Board. Do you have a question?
Yeah, thank you, Margaret. Mayor Pete, when you were on the campaign trail, you spoke a lot about trust. What resonated with the voters that you met and reached out to, and how can we get them to trust government again and not simply rely on disinformation and propaganda and stuff like Fox and Friends?
This is critically important. I mean, the entire democratic model, democratic legitimacy, depends on trust, and trust is at historic lows. In the 1960s, more than 3/4 of Americans said that they trust the government in Washington to do the right thing most of the time. Now that number is usually in the teens when they count. And a whole series of things have gone into that. Policy failures and corruption dating back to Watergate and Vietnam, but also an ideological project here at home to directly attack and undermine trust in US institutions, which we now know has been abetted by a strategic project from foreign players like Russia to further that work. And sometimes it happens in subtle ways that are just designed to discredit American institutions generally. I'll give you an example. There's a public health journal that did a survey of Russian troll activity from 2014 to 2017. So through before, during, and after the election of Donald Trump. And what these health researchers looked at very specifically was trolls and bots that they knew to be Russian talking about the subject of vaccines. And what they found was that they were pushing anti-vax messaging, discredited anti-vax misinformation, and some pro-vaccine messaging as well. In other words, their goal was to increase the level of controversy itself. Unfortunately, this also coincides with the business interests of certain outlets, and Fox is certainly part of this, not the only part of this, that will benefit from the fact that the human brain, the human eye, is drawn to this kind of controversy. So what does it take to reverse that? Well, one of the things that resonated the most when I was speaking with people, including in very conservative areas of the American Midwest on the campaign trail, was the idea of coming together in a national project that related to something we knew would benefit us. This is why, again, though climate represents a colossal threat to America, I think it represents a major opportunity. Imagine if the way we felt when we were thinking about the issue of climate had a little less to do with doom or guilt and a little more to do with pride. If projects to deal with climate arouse the same kind of national emotions that, let's say, the moon landing did, or the national mobilization to win World War II did, that's something that I think can cut across some of these incentives that speak to what you might call our lizard brain, that will respond to controversy wherever we find it. And will be as responsive to misinformation as it is to truth sometimes, and allows us to connect across these lines in a project that has greater meaning for us, but also, again, holds out the promise of representing an America leading on something that everyone in the world knows is a problem, and that frankly won't get fixed unless America gets its act together. So that's just one example of an issue area where a national mobilization can help to build the forms of trust that are needed. The other thing that I think is really powerful, that was certainly part of my own experience, is the kind of trust formed in service. In the military, you find yourself trusting your life to people who are radically different from you, people with different life experiences, different politics for sure. But every time I got into a vehicle with somebody, we were trusting each other with our lives. And, military service isn't for everybody, but forms of service, national service visions, an expansion of things like AmeriCorps. These are things that in many countries have been known to build a level of social trust that then in turn can be a foundation for the kind of political trust that we are in a race against time to establish or reestablish so that we can proceed as a country and lead on the international stage.
Um, Thank you for that. I want to also go to another board member, Ebru Özdemir, who I believe is joining us from Turkey.
Yes, thank you, Ms. Brennan. And for Mr. Mayor, my name is Ebru, joining from Turkey, and I'm also a member of Atlantic Council's International Advisory Board. And my question is actually, I've touched upon it a couple of times, but when you think of all the things happening right now, you know, in this today's change world after COVID-19, rising tensions, complicating situations, especially where I'm at right now, you know, the tensions between Azerbaijan and Armenia, unresolved crisis in Syria, developments in the East Med. So how do you assess the role of the United States in global politics in the upcoming years? Thank you very much.
Well, thank you. And, you know, so many of the regional issues you're talking about are ones where I think the U.S. Can play a constructive role, even if it is simply as a partner at the table with an international community that is concerned with promoting stability and peace and prosperity compatible with human rights. But it only works if the U.S. is practicing what we preach. It only works if we're coming from a place of credibility. We cannot talk about standing with our allies or ask our allies to stand with us if we're this unpredictable and unstable. We cannot urge leaders around the world to respect things like press freedoms if the US president is echoing that vocabulary of authoritarians and characterizing the press as the enemy of the people. I still believe, perhaps even more than before, because of the instability, that the US can play a constructive role, not only in helping to address individual challenges of regional and global security, but in helping us reimagine the institutions that were set up after World War II on certain terms, and of course set up largely by the US, but that we know are ready to be refreshed. And I think that if other countries, and I'm thinking about the role that countries like where you are can play and have established in terms of their stature regionally and globally. If we can create a framework where countries see their own legitimate aspirations and security interests better served through participation in these regional and international frameworks. If the U.S. is seen as opening a door to that, rather than either selectively preserving in amber what was encoded in 1946, or blowing up whatever's there for our own advantage, right? If we have that other model, then I have to believe that the U.S. will be a very constructive force. But of course, it all begins by walking the walk here at home.
Thank you, Ebru. I want to go to some audience questions now, which are coming into me via text. So I'll read them to you. This one is from Jonathan Tepperman, editor-in-chief of Foreign Policy magazine. How is your foreign policy vision different from traditional liberal internationalism?
Well, I think in many ways it's because it's happening in a different context. I still think we can sustain and recover a lot of the best elements of the liberal internationalist framework. But we've got to recognize that we're simply on a different playing field. I think we're also in a world where the role of technology, for example, is sometimes a difference in category and calls on us to reimagine the kinds of communities that are at stake. In other words, in terms of political engagement in the world that I'm mostly in, the nation state remains the unit of analysis. But that's not always true for the kinds of communities that are being built transnationally online. And I'm not sure that any of the frameworks or schools of thought that were in the IR textbook I was carrying around Oxford in the mid 2000s really are able to account for the importance of what was contemplated as was described as civil society, but is something perhaps different in its nature that can play a really vital role for good or ill as it is mobilized or as it is hacked, so to speak. And when I say hacked, I'm not just talking about like technical issues of computer systems being hacked. I'm talking about how our affinities, how our identities, how our attention collectively as well as individually might be hacked in ways that are cutting across the kind of political boundaries that we're used to thinking of as the way for assessing how states treat one another. This, frankly, is not a fundamentally different outlook than I think that to which my party and people of my general school of domestic political thought think. But it is going to call for us to add new features that just weren't contemplated by the frameworks that I learned in school.
So it tees up this question from Will O'Brien. What are the key skills and competencies for the next generation of foreign policy professionals to develop?
Well, I think we have a huge opportunity here to reimagine what is asked of foreign policy professionals as they venture out into careers in diplomacy. Obviously, some of the skills haven't changed one bit. A deep understanding of history, a readiness to engage linguistically and culturally with other countries, and a readiness to understand these overlapping frameworks: political, cultural, religious, national, but transnational. And by the way, I also think more than before, subnational. Maybe this is my mayor's eye view revealing itself, but if you look at the ways in which certain issues have been difficult for national capitals to deal with, but cities have come together, not waiting for their national governments to catch up. Look at the C40, for example, contending with climate issues. This is another example of something that isn't really contemplated by some of our older ideological frameworks that I think will play an increasingly important role. So all of that's to say, a mastery of those things will remain important as never before. I think collectively, having that body of professionals reflect a remarkably diverse country, and it just hasn't happened. Racial diversity and many other forms of diversity in the diplomatic corps simply have not reflected this country. That needs to happen. And then I think about the skills that can be sort of cross-pollinated from other disciplines. I remember when I was in Afghanistan as an advisor, I was working on an economic development puzzle, sitting in a kind of plywood hut with a mix of civilians like me. This was outside of my military work when I was a consultant. There's civilians like me and military folks around. I just said out loud, I wish I could figure out sitting here, I wish somebody could tell me how many megawatts it takes to run a canning plant so I can solve this agricultural puzzle. And the guy sitting next to me, who was a major, turned around and said, I can tell you all about it, because he worked at Oscar Mayer in his day job in Missouri, but he was a member of the National Guard and he'd been mobilized. That cross-pollination of civilian competencies with military is one of the reasons the reserve is such an interesting place to be. But we still in the US mostly rely on a model for diplomatic service where, unless you are a political appointee, you are expected to be committed to a 20 years plus career in order to participate in a substantive way at all. I wonder if there's some opportunities. It won't quite be like a reserve model, but what opportunities exist to better harness the insights and professional capacities that are gained in the private sector, in the tech sector, in other areas of life, and bring those in and out in a more flowing way of foreign policy practice. These are the examples of why I think, even though the destruction that got us here should never have happened, the hollowing out of the ranks of diplomatic and other forms of civil service may present us with a historic opportunity, in the same way that in some places post-war architecture flourishes in the wake of destruction. Maybe the human architecture of how we put together our diplomatic corps and our broader professional world for foreign policy and foreign affairs. Maybe there's a chance to build it on more imaginative terms than we've had in our lifetime.
This question is on China and in regard to how America deals with their growing influence. This is from Charlotte Rosen, and she asks, what are our objectives?
Well, our main objective, of course, is to make sure that U.S. interests and values are supported and vindicated. The aspirations and values that we stand for are not just parochial American values. They're shared by people around the world. That's why often, historically, we found that even when regimes are hostile, to American objectives, the people who live under them have been sympathetic, and that's been our long-term strategic advantage. When it comes to dealing with China, then we should consider how to be advancing our values that are human and not just American values, which, if I'm right about that, are therefore in no way anti-Chinese. When there are, in fact, simple clashes of interests, and that may happen economically, I think what we need to do is be ready to balance the strategic with the short-term economic. There are areas where I think we should be cooperating more, but there are also areas where we have clearly become too interdependent. If you consider the strategic significance of pharmaceutical supply chains, for example, or a lot of what's going on in terms of electronics and telecom. We've clearly allowed ourselves to get mixed in a way that is not to the benefit of US interests. And also, if you consider surveillance capacities built into certain pieces of technology, really a problem from the perspective of US values too. So the overall objective has to be engagement in a way that benefits goals that we have both as a democracy that wishes to see democracy and the vindication of human rights continue to grow, and as a country that needs to know we're going to be secure, not only from the interventions or aggressions of other states, but from global threats like the pandemic, like climate change, that frankly threaten China as much as they threaten us, and therefore present a realm for tremendous cooperation. If we can get it to happen on good faith terms.
This question is from Jonathan Thomas. How do we explain what's happening in America to European friends and family? How do you explain the division?
It's a painful thing to do. Then again, of course, we're not the only country experiencing far-right populism, experiencing a rise in xenophobia. In fact, many of the features of what have us at home very worried were prefigured just by a beat or so by developments in politics in Europe. And so instead of seeking to explain what's going on here to European friends and family, I would be engaging our friends and family transatlantically about ways that they have seen these forces start to recede or be beaten back, and see how much of that applies by analogy here at home. The other thing to remember is that we are talking about a long arc of US history that is obviously in a chaotic season that I think doesn't reflect the American people. Remember, this president who is obviously dominating the world's understanding of America right now is still supported by a minority of the American people. Now, that minority of supporters of this president is disconcertingly large. But let's be clear that this does not reflect the settled judgment of the American people on where this country ought to go, either at home or in our relationships with others.
I want to, given the time, toss it back to Mr. Vicente Garcia at the Atlantic Council.
Thank you, Margaret, and thank you, Mayor Pete Buttigieg. It's great to hear about your thoughts on the future of U.S. foreign policy and restoring U.S. leadership, the importance of working with our allies for a global common good, and to including diverse voices into shaping U.S. foreign policy, all issues important to the Atlantic Council community. To our viewers watching from all over the world, thank you for joining us today. Today's event was hosted by the Atlantic Council's New American Engagement Initiative, so you may learn more about their work as well as watch their latest event featuring House Majority Whip Jim Clyburn presented on this platform on our website. You can also continue to engage in this conversation by tweeting AC Front Page. And thanks again. We look forward to seeing you next time.